Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some stories involving unidentified cryptids, and I must say that these stories are possibly some of the creepiest yet fascinating stories I've come across. They include a creature showing up to make a hunting trip go bad, a very bizarre encounter in Arizona, a creature stalking someone on a farm in Portugal, and a series of encounters in Texas that has a girl fearing for her life. But first, we start with a story from Iowa where a young man and his mother have both encountered something they cannot explain. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Iowa, where the original poster, or OP, believes he and his mother saw a creature that was either a skinwalker or Wendigo. But as we get into this story, I think it may be something else entirely. The OP does not say where in Iowa his story takes place, just that he lived in a neighborhood consisting of at least 25 homes that is completely surrounded by a forest. He says he has spent a lot of time watching horror movies, with most of them taking place in a forest, so he was already on alert when he was outside. The first sighting of the creature the OP and his mother believed to be in the forest where they live happened a few years into them living in Iowa. He was staying with his mother at the time and mentions that she is full Native American, as is her side of the family. He isn't sure what tribe, but they are fully aware of the lore involving skinwalkers and Wendigo, and fully believe it to be true. One day when he was staying with his mother, she was in her car on her way home, driving on a road that was lined by forest on each side. There were also 2 farms and a couple of houses in the area. As she drove up a hill near their neighborhood, she came to a field where she saw a creature walking into the forest. She described what she saw as having gray skin, being tall, and having hooves for feet. Confused by what she saw, she checked the rearview mirror when she reached a stop sign but saw nothing. She became frightened and took off for home, fully believing she had just seen a Wendigo. She told the OP what happened when she got home, which sent a jolt of fear through him as he recalled the stories he heard on YouTube, especially those involving skinwalkers. From that point on, he was cautious and remained on alert while riding his bike outside. But one day he rode his bike near the hill where his mother saw the creature. His reason for going to the area was to take pictures of the landscape. However, he felt extremely paranoid the entire time he was near the field where his mother saw this thing. Trusting his gut, he jumped back on his bike and left the area, feeling as though he was being watched the entire time, especially while riding past the field. A few days after his weird experience at the field, it was night and his dog needed to be let out. So he let his dog out and put it on a leash that was attached to the porch. He turned the outside light on to keep an eye on his dog like he normally did, but he also had food cooking in the kitchen. He went to the kitchen to check on his food when he heard his dog start barking. Being that it was late, he didn't want his dog to wake the neighbors, so he hurried back out to see that his dog was barking at something in the darkness beyond the porch's light. He opened the door and told his dog to be quiet, but he just kept barking at something in the darkness. He then tried to get him to come inside, but he just kept barking. The OP got a bad feeling as paranoia came over him, and he looked into the darkness to see eyeshine within the trees, reflected by the porch's light. He finally reached down and grabbed the leash, pulling on it while yelling at his dog to get inside. When his dog was safely inside, the OP slammed and locked the door before going around and making sure all the windows and doors were locked and covered so no one or nothing could see inside. 2 months after he saw those eyes shining in the darkness and at the time of his posting, he continued his routine each night, making sure all the doors and windows were locked and covered. When he did go outside, he felt like he needed to be with a group of people or have a weapon with him. I don't think eyeshine is something any of us would want to see while looking into the darkness around our home at night. I'm just glad he was able to get his dog back inside and there was no further incident. As for what this is, I don't think it was a skinwalker because the mother who saw the creature was able to describe what she saw as a Wendigo. However, in the Algonquin lore and legend, Wendigo are not said to have hooved feet. There is a creature, though, that is usually described as having hooved feet and is often misidentified as a Wendigo. That creature is known as a Witchuge. She doesn't give a description of the head, but perhaps she didn't see it. But given the fact that she described the feet as being hooved and her thinking it was a Wendigo makes me think there's a Witchuge hanging around the OP's neighborhood. For those who may not know, the Witchuge is the creature seen in many descriptions of what people think a Wendigo looks like. It is anywhere from 15 to 20 feet tall, sometimes taller, has a skull-like head and antlers. It is also usually depicted as having hooved feet. In any case, I don't blame the OP for covering the windows at night and being on high alert when outside, especially when he is in the forest. Hopefully he and his mother have seen the last of this creature. What do you think it was? Skinwalker, Wendigo, Witchuge, or something else? The next story comes from Pennsylvania, where a young man had 2 encounters with a being while on a hunting trip. But let me just say that this story involves mimicry and is one of the creepiest stories I've heard involving this technique due to what each person hears. And we also have another story where encounters are accompanied by weird dreams. The original poster posted his story with other skinwalker stories because he believes this is what he encountered out there 2 days in a row. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that it happened at his family's hunting cabin in December of 2020. The planned trip was supposed to be 2 weeks long, with the OP, his father, grandfather, and his brother arriving just before 5 on the first day. They still had some daylight left, so they decided to head out into the woods to see if they could get some hunting done on that first day. So the OP, his brother, and their father set out into the forest and quickly found some tracks in the lightly snow-covered ground from the snow that had fallen earlier in the day. They walked for about 5 minutes until they found 2 sets of tracks and some scat they recognized as belonging to a buck. They split up then, with the OP following one set of tracks and his brother and father following the second. The OP walked on a ways until the forest started becoming unpassable and he could not see more than 30 yards in front of him. So he sat down and leaned against a tree with his rifle. Approximately 15 minutes passed with the OP sitting there having a snack and drinking some water when the entire forest around him went silent. There was no noise whatsoever, and the OP describes the experience as being like he suddenly went deaf. Then he heard loud crunches and pops of sticks and leaves under footsteps that were way too heavy to be a deer and couldn't have been a bear because they didn't see many out during the winter. The OP was then hit with an awful smell he describes as smelling like meat that had been left outside to rot in the sun for weeks. This is when he knew something wasn't right. He remained in that same spot for about 5 more minutes before the feeling that he was being watched came over him. He says he isn't one to get scared easily, but this sensation was enough to make him pack up his things, grab his gun, and head back to the cabin, looking behind him every few yards. He got back to the cabin right around 6 o'clock, and it was dark out. His father, grandfather, and brother were sitting around a campfire eating hot dogs and beans. The OP pulled up a chair and joined them, grabbing a hot dog. His father asked him if he saw anything, but instead of telling them what happened, he just said he saw nothing besides snow and birds. He didn't think it would be a good idea to tell them what he smelled and heard. Later that night, while he was lying in bed, he texted a family friend who was around 50 years old at the time of his post and told him he had a weird experience in the woods. When the family friend asked him what happened, the OP told him he smelled something terrible out there and heard very heavy footsteps. The family friend asked him what kind of smell, and the OP replied and told him that it was of rotting meat. The family friend then said he was afraid he'd say that and told him a story about what happened to him back in 1999 when he was hunting. He had been sitting in the woods when a smell came over him that smelled like rotting flesh before everything went silent. He didn't see anything, but 15 minutes after the forest went still, he heard his mother's voice call for him to come here. He heard the voice clear as day, and there was no question in his mind it was her voice. The only problem with that was his mother had passed away 2 years prior to his experience. He ran out of those woods, never looked back, and didn't go hunting again. When the OP read this, he dropped his phone out of pure shock and pulled the blankets up over himself and went to bed. That night he had a terrible dream that he was being chased by a deer that wasn't really a deer. Right before it attacked him, he woke up sweating and screaming. His story picks up the next day when he was out hunting. He had taken up a position in a tree stand they installed during the summer and was there for about an hour when everything went quiet. He once again heard approaching footsteps and was overcome by that same smell from the previous day. However, this time he did see the creature. He describes it as something that looked like a deer but had ragged skin hanging off of it, no tail, and the skin on its face was drooped down way farther than it should have been. Shaking like he never had before, he raised his gun and fired at this creature twice before it ran off with inhuman speed, screaming and crying like crazy, as the OP puts it. His father radioed him about 5 minutes later and asked if he got something. That's when the OP told him he shot at something that looked like a deer and to just please get to his position before dropping his radio. 15 minutes later, his father, grandfather, and brother showed up and had to help him down from the tree stand. He told him what he shot at and that it looked like a doe, but it was just different somehow. He described the creature to them, but they didn't believe him. He says he didn't blame them for that, and it almost sounded too crazy for him to believe himself. But then something happened that made them all believe. Something called out to them saying, "Where are you?" But the weirdest and creepiest part of them hearing this voice was that they all heard it in their own mother's voice. The OP's grandfather heard his mother's voice, his father heard his mother's, and the OP and his brother heard theirs. The same thing said to them at the same moment, but all of them hearing it in a different voice. This was followed by a baby crying somewhere in the woods. The OP says they felt kind of bad leaving with the crying baby sound, but they knew it wasn't real and they got out of there. When they reached the cabin, they began packing up their belongings when they heard a thud on the front door. The OP opened it with his rifle in hand and found 2 dead rabbits lying on the porch. Both of them had their stomachs ripped out. They quickly packed the truck and drove out of there, driving as fast as they could. The OP describes it as the longest ride of his life. Not long after, they sold the property and none of them would go back. The new owners had the cabin for about a year when they started having weird things happen. The OP ends his post by asking if they should tell the new owners what happened to them out there. There's just something about this story that really creeps me out. The dream, the voices, the dead rabbits thrown at the front door. Seems like something in that forest did not like the OP and his family being out there. And it doesn't seem to have stopped with them. I've always said it's such a shame when these creatures rob us of something we love. It usually involves going out into the wilderness to camp or to hunt like the OP in this story. And for it to be with his family too, and it sounding like a yearly trip makes it that much more of a shame. Hopefully they can find somewhere else to go to spend some time together, like perhaps a bright sunny beach somewhere. I know he says he thinks it's a skinwalker, but I'm not so sure. It's strange how he described what he shot at as looking like a deer with the skin hanging off of it. The speed he says it ran off with, though, definitely makes me think it's a cryptid, especially with the smell, the forest going quiet, and the heavy footsteps. Then there is the voice they all heard. But what was really unsettling about this story for me was that they all heard whatever was calling them to come in a different voice. The voices of their mothers. I'll admit this is a new one for me. I haven't heard of this happening before, and I find it very fascinating. As for what I think this could be, I kind of want to say Wachuge, given that the description of the creature was that of a deer. I was thinking perhaps a Wendigo until he said it looked like a deer. This is definitely a bizarre encounter. I'm glad everyone was able to get out of there safely. What do you think this was? The next story comes from a poster who believes they encountered a skinwalker in Arizona, an area of the United States where skinwalker sightings are commonplace, as it is in very close proximity to Navajo Nation. He was not in Navajo Nation at the time of his sighting and encounter, but does say that he drove through several reservations at the time. Most of them, he says, were Navajo reservations. He was in Arizona with some friends, heading to one of his friends' home in southern Arizona. His friend told the group that if they saw someone standing on the side of the road, they shouldn't pay any attention to them and definitely shouldn't make eye contact with them. Well, a couple of hours into the drive through Arizona, the OP and his friend who was driving were the only ones awake in the car, when they came across a man standing on the side of the road dressed in tan leather from head to toe, wearing a large wide-brimmed hat. Instead of heeding his friend's warning and not paying the man any attention, the OP looked directly at him. From that point on, every couple of miles he would see the man, dressed in all tan leather, standing on the side of the road looking at him. He would catch quick glimpses of his face every now and then, but the man didn't seem to have one. Fear settled in, and the OP decided to just close his eyes until they got to his friend's town. He didn't see the man or anything else for the rest of the trip. However, this wouldn't be his only trip to the area, as they head out there every year. The most recent trip to the area before he made his post, he and his friends had gone to his friend's family's cabin that they owned up in the mountains. Their car got stuck in the snow and they had to call a towing company to send someone to get them out of their current predicament. The OP talked at length with the man sent by the company, and he distinctly remembers him being Native American, having long black hair, and wearing a tan suit, which even included an animal skin on his shoulders. He was not wearing a hat though. The man was very friendly and kept saying he wanted to eat dinner with the OP and his friends. They declined because they didn't have enough food, but the man said he would get some more and bring it back. But again, they told him no. Not long before posting, he and his friends were talking about that day, and his friends didn't see a Native American man sent by the towing company. They all swore up and down that the man had short blonde hair, a southern accent, was wearing snow gear, and never once asked to eat with them. The OP's friend asked him if he had seen anything unusual elsewhere, so the OP told him about the man he saw on the side of the road during their previous trip. His friend told him he had seen a skinwalker and it was following him. Being that the OP lived on the East Coast, his friend believed the skinwalker only came looking for him when he was in Arizona or the surrounding area. Since this second encounter, the OP now has constant dreams about going back to Arizona. He ends his post saying no one believes him except for his one friend and asks whoever reads his account for their opinions about what is happening to him. At the time of his post, he and his friends had a trip to Arizona planned that he was nervous about. His story was posted a year ago and there haven't been any updates. He does, however, continue to post, so he looks to be doing alright, and it would seem his most recent trip to Arizona was uneventful. This would be such a bizarre and creepy occurrence, to see a man standing on the side of the road only to continue seeing him at certain intervals during the rest of the drive, and then to see a completely different person than that of his friends. I'll be honest here, I think I remember a story where I heard something like this happening once, but it was nothing like this, where he stood talking to this person for a long time only to find out his friends saw someone completely different. And then to have that man insist on coming to eat dinner with them that evening? If his friend is right and this is a skinwalker, then it has definitely chosen him as its prey and looks like it will stop at nothing to get him. But with no further post by the OP, it would seem like this supposed skinwalker either lost interest or moved on. I have heard though, and there is one commenter on this post who says that once a skinwalker picks a target, they will stop at nothing until they get them. There were also others in the comments who suggested the OP consult someone to see what they could do to ward this skinwalker off. He seemed to be leaning in that direction, so let's hope that's what he did, and he was able to ward off this skinwalker. What do you think about this one? Have you ever heard of this happening? Where one person sees a completely different person than everyone else around them? The next story comes from Portugal, where the original poster had two weird experiences he cannot explain he believes could have been a skinwalker. Given that he lives in Portugal, there is very little chance of it being a skinwalker, but that doesn't mean he didn't encounter something around his home. He describes where he lives as very rural, with some farms and other homes in the area. The way he describes it makes it sound like these other homes are close, but not too close. However, from atop the wall around his home, he can see his neighbors' homes. The area is heavily forested, which completely encompasses the farm where he lives. His first encounter happened when he had two friends over for dinner. They were eating outside and everything was fine until they began hearing a woman scream. He says it was very odd as there is very little crime where he lives and no animal attacks. The forest where he lives contains a variety of birds, but nothing like mountain lions, bobcats, or bears. Hunters have wiped out most of the animals there, according to the OP. On high alert by this point, he was the first to react and climb the wall that separates his home from the part of the farm that contained the animals. From this vantage point, he could see his neighbors' homes. His friends climbed up beside him on the wall, where they wait to see if they heard any more screams. Sure enough, they heard the scream again, but couldn't understand what it was saying. Then they heard it a third time, the same woman's voice yelling for help. This was followed by the voice speaking a bunch of gibberish. One of his friends called the police, being that their first thought was domestic violence or a robbery. The OP jumped down from the wall, retrieved his axe, and walked up to his gate. His friend followed, but they stopped inside the wall, not leaving the grounds, being that something just wasn't right about the screams. The OP says they sounded odd. Therefore, they had no idea what awaited them should they go through the gate. So they remained where they were and waited for the police. Before the police arrived, they heard a thud followed by the breaking of glass they assumed was a window. However, when the police arrived, they found nothing. The screaming had stopped and seemed to vanish. Later that night, the OP and his friends were talking about what happened that day when one of his friends told them he had heard those same screams, the same woman's voice, before while walking his dog. The next day, they decided to venture into the forest where they thought they heard the screams come from, expecting to find a house. But when they arrived at the place they thought a house would be, there was nothing, only forest. They went back to the OP's house and decided to forget about what happened. The OP mentions here that no one thought to connect what happened to a skinwalker, including himself, but then he had his second encounter, and that's when he believed it could be one. One night, his cousins had come over to visit and for dinner. They decided to take a walk in his garden, which was separated from the forest by only a small stone wall. As he and his one cousin walked and talked, having a good time, they began hearing a man's voice speaking gibberish just like the woman's voice from his first encounter. He says the voice was not normal and sounded like something was in the man's throat, like it had an odd frequency to it. The OP went and got his axe while his cousin called his sister to come out to the garden. They went to the wall and heard the voice continuously speaking gibberish without a break and not even taking a breath. After listening for a while, they decided there was nothing they could do but go finish their dinner. Once the OP's cousin left, he began feeling a bit unsettled and remembered all the nights his dog would bark at the forest. He found this odd, being that all the animals had been wiped out by hunters. This made him remember the warnings his parents would give him when he was a child, telling him to be out of the forest and have all the doors locked by sunset. He would ask them why, but they would never tell him. He always found it odd, being that they lived in a calm little location in a calm country. He could not understand what they were so worried about. Everything came to an end when lumberjacks came and leveled the forest. After that, he didn't have any more weird experiences and his dog stopped barking at the forest. I don't think this is a skinwalker, but then that poses the question of, what is it? One commenter thinks it could be a crawler. Whatever the case is, I'm a bit stumped by this one. It would seem his parents knew something was out there given that they told him to be inside by nightfall as a child. Whatever it was, maybe it's a good thing that lumberjacks came and leveled the forest to force this thing to move on. It seemed to have taken an interest in the OP. But luckily, just like with wild animals, you take away something's habitat, it is forced to find a new one. Hopefully, it hasn't picked a new target. What do you think this thing was? The final story of this episode comes from Texas and involves a girl who keeps seeing and hearing a creature she believes is following her. It has gotten to the point that she fears for her life when she is outside at night. She posted her encounters online in hopes of getting some advice on why this could be happening to her and how she can stop it. She does not say where exactly her story takes place. The first encounter the OP details took place in spring of 2021, when she and her friend were hiking on a trail that was 10 or so minutes from her house. They had walked about half a mile down the trail when they started hearing a woman screaming, and it sounded like she was in mortal danger. She was screaming and pleading for someone to come and help her. The girls yelled back if they should call someone, but the voice didn't answer. It just kept screaming the same things over and over. The girls' first thought was to leave the woods and call the police, but instead they decided to go get a better look to see if they could help this woman who was clearly in trouble. So they picked up some rocks and started down the trail toward where they heard the screams. But then they heard a male voice scream at the woman to shut up or he would kill her. Then the voices fell silent. It was then that the girls decided to call the police. They started with the non-emergency line, who told them to call 911. The dispatcher then told them to wait by the trail's entrance for an officer to arrive, which is exactly what they did. About 10 minutes later, an officer showed up and, according to the OP, was very suspicious of two 15-year-old girls calling in a possible homicide. She says the officer searched the trail for about 20 minutes but found nothing. The officers got their names and said they'd call them if anything came up, but they never did. When the OP got home, she told her sister what happened, and she told the OP it might have been a skinwalker trying to lure them into the woods by mimicking someone needing help. Their father had told them about the skinwalker legends before. The OP told her that sounded crazy, but what her sister said stuck with her. Her next encounter would take place just a few nights after the first, while she was out at night walking her family's dogs with her sister. During their walk, her sister looked over at something and chuckled. When the OP asked her what she was laughing at, her sister asked why a trash can was sitting in the middle of the road. The OP looked past their community's gate and saw what her sister was talking about, but it was not a trash can. It was a white creature with skinny legs and arms and hands that looked like claws. It started moving toward them, but looked very strange and unnatural in its movements. The OP says it didn't look human, but it wasn't animalistic either. She says she has never run so fast in her entire life, and when they got home they told their mother what happened, but she looked at them like they were crazy. However, when they told their father, a worried look came over his face and he told them about something he experienced while camping. The creature he saw then was eerily similar to what his daughters saw that night. They did not walk their dogs at night for a while after the incident. Eventually, enough time passed that everything went back to normal and the OP says she felt safe. Her third encounter would happen in January of 2022 after she made some new friends and was hanging out with them one night. One of her friends had a place they referred to as a hideout in the woods that they wanted to show the rest of the group. Everyone agreed, so they set out into the forest at night, a decision the OP says wasn't the smartest given what she had been through to that point. But she was in a good neighborhood and once again felt safe, so off they went. But as they were walking through the woods, they heard someone scream for help. This time it was a man's voice. The OP knew better than to investigate, so she snapped at the group to run for the car. When they reached the car, she told them about skinwalkers and her previous encounters. They of course looked at her like she was crazy until she pulled up a video and showed it to them. The video sounded exactly like what they had just heard. The OP avoided nighttime trips to the woods for a while after that, but eventually the incident with her friends faded from memory and she went back into the woods at night. Her next experience with this creature happened a little more than a month before she posted her stories online. She thought her encounters with the being, whatever it was, were over and done. But unfortunately for her, she was wrong. She had once again ventured into the woods at night with one of her friends who was with her during her last encounter. They were walking along when the OP dropped her phone and they stopped to look for it. And they once again heard screaming coming from the darkness around them. This time it was the voice of a little boy yelling for help. The OP couldn't quite make out everything the boy was saying, but had heard enough, so she and her friend got out of there as quickly as they could. After this, she had yet another encounter, with this one happening a few weeks before posting online to tell her story and seek advice. The OP and her sister were once again walking their dog when they heard incoherent screaming. They yelled back, offering help to whoever was in need, but whoever it was, or whatever it was, just kept screaming incoherently. Once again knowing what was up and what they needed to do, the girls went straight back home. The last and most recent encounter documented by the OP took place just 2 nights before she posted her story, when she and her friends were walking around a ditch by one of their homes. They had just been there the night before and didn't think it would be dangerous. But the night would take a scary turn as they saw something when they were about half a mile away from their car. One of her friends at first thought it was just a sign, but then it moved. They could only see a black silhouette due to how dark it was where this creature was standing, but the OP says it looked like it either had horns or its arms raised over its head. The group took off for the car when this thing started moving toward them. The OP hasn't been outside past dark since this latest encounter. She hasn't told anyone about her most recent encounter because she is afraid of the backlash for once again going outside at night. She ends her post saying she had to tell someone and it lessens the burden getting it off her chest by posting it online. She also says that she genuinely fears for her life. If I had any advice for the OP, it would be to please stop going outside after dark. Joking aside, it does seem like this thing has taken an interest in her, as the screamings and sightings of this creature seem to revolve around her. The first time they heard the woman screaming, she and her friends should have just ignored it and left the area. Now, I'm not saying it's their fault. They didn't know any better at the time, and these mimics can replicate voices exactly. There's no way they could have known. But she did start ignoring the screams after that first encounter, which is good, and immediately leaves when she hears them. I'm thinking if she continues to stay inside at night, maybe this thing will eventually lose interest and move on. However, if she does go out during the day, especially into the woods, I wouldn't go alone. As for what this thing is, a few things come to mind: skinwalker, crawler, or goatman. If they live in a part of Texas near New Mexico, then it isn't out of the realm of possibilities that a skinwalker could be there. When she saw the creature though, she said it looked like it had horns. My immediate thought when I read this was goatman, which has been spotted in Texas numerous times. Then there are the similarities to a crawler in these stories. However, after reading this story once again for this recording, I think it could be a goatman. In any case, all 3 cryptids are said to be able to mimic screams and voices perfectly, trying to lure people into the forest or deeper into the forest. What do you think she keeps seeing and hearing? And what should she do to get this thing to leave her alone? Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some very interesting Dogman encounters I found on the internet. These include a story where a hunter feels more like he is being the one hunted, yet another story where a dogman, possibly more than one, seemed to have taken a curious interest in a young couple and/or are escorting them out of their territory, and one man in search of answers in eastern Tennessee. But first, we start with a story from Minnesota where a young woman seems to have caught the attention of a dogman, and the cryptid seems to have attached itself to her. Alright, let's get to today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from Minnesota and is definitely one of the more interesting ones and scary ones I have come across. The original poster, or OP, does not say where exactly the story takes place, just that she lives in central Minnesota. The OP believes she has a dogman near her home but isn't sure, so she has turned to the internet for answers. She has been seeing a massive wolf in the area where she lives and knows wolves don't usually live that far south in Minnesota. She begins her story before actually laying eyes on this creature. A few days before she saw the massive wolf, she noticed the very strong smell of urine near her home. It was as if whatever was doing it was urinating all over every tree in and around her yard. The smell got so bad she almost convinced herself that her neighbors were letting their dogs urinate only in her yard. The smell was so pungent it made her gag. She says one night at around 10 p.m. she heard what sounded like a dog walking behind her on the pavement. She spun around and said, "Knock it off," angrily, and it did not happen again. To add to the strangeness encompassing her home, there would be knocks on the front door that everyone in the house could hear. But when they go to answer the door, there would be no one there. On top of this, something is mimicking the voices of different people who live in her home, but the person being mimicked is usually out of town. She has heard the voices of the people being mimicked who are out of town calling for help. But what she actually saw one night was an enormous wolf with jet black fur. She describes the fur of the creature as being impossibly black and absorbing light. The wolf she found standing about 20 feet from her one night was on all fours and was approximately 5 feet tall. She is 5 feet 9 inches and says it was almost as tall as her while down on all fours. Her first instinct was to baby talk the creature, but it either didn't hear her or completely ignored her. So she whistled at the gigantic wolf like you would a domestic dog, and it immediately stopped and snapped its head around in her direction. Its piercing amber eyes locked onto hers. She knew in that moment trying to interact with the being was a terrible mistake, and she had not fully taken in just how big this thing was. Then, the wolf started slowly walking toward her. That's when the OP stumbled backward and ran faster than she thought possible all the way home. When she reached her house, she ran into the garage and slammed the door behind her, locking it. But she still did not feel safe, which she describes as a weird sensation, being that she should have felt safe in her own home. She says her internal voice was screaming at her that she still was not safe and she needed to get inside the house immediately. She also says she swears she could sense the creature just outside her garage. At the time though, she thought it was just a regular wolf and found it ridiculous that her instincts were telling her this wolf could get to her through a locked door. She has also heard a number of howls in unison from what she believes is more than one dogman in the area. The town where she lives has had a number of UFO sightings in the past, and the howling seems to ramp up when the floating orbs are near and closer to the ground, making her believe it could all be related. She wants to investigate further but doesn't want to go out alone. She says most people act like they don't believe her, but are in a hurry to get indoors by nightfall. This begs the question, if they don't believe her, then what's so scary about the night? Her post ends there, but I did see in the comments where she tells someone she left a steak in what looked like a den because she did not want the giant wolf to leave, but instead she wants to be friends with it. However, it hasn't come back around, but she has heard heavy footsteps on her roof. I believe this is a dogman and it has taken a particular interest in her. The way it urinated on the trees near where she lives makes me think it was marking its territory. Or maybe it didn't urinate at all and that was just the smell of the Dogman when it was close to her home. When people describe smelling cryptids, they oftentimes say they smell a very strong scent of urine and or death. Then, also making me think it has taken an interest in her is the fact that it was following along behind her that one night. Not to mention the knocks on the front door. I've heard stories where dogmen seem to take interest in people and have been known to come right up to their homes. They are also usually described as having fur so black that it stands out from the night, which is eerily similar to how she described the giant wolf's fur. As for the mimicking voices, I haven't heard that dogmen can do that. It makes me think that there might be something else hanging around her area as well. The UFOs also point to this being the case. This wouldn't be the first time I've heard of more than one cryptid in an area before. It also isn't the first time I've heard theories of a link between UFOs and cryptids. As for going out to investigate it or leaving stuff for it, I would strongly recommend against that. I've heard way too many stories where people gift these beings and things seem to be going great, but then for whatever reason they stop gifting and things begin to go horribly wrong. It just isn't wise to seek them out or start gifting with them. This is based on stories I've heard and read going deep down this rabbit hole. She also mentions how big of a mistake she realized it was to interact with it when she whistled at it. I would keep that feeling in mind if I were her and had the strong urge to seek this creature out or leave anything else for it. What do you think she's encountering? Dogman? Something else? Or more than one cryptid? The next story was actually a comment in response to the first story. The commenter shared a story from 2007 that took place near Janesville, Minnesota, thinking it could be related to or possibly be the same dogman the original poster of the first story encountered. However, the original poster confirmed that this story takes place too far away from her location for them to be linked. It is a story the commenter saw on an old website that is no longer active. Janesville is located in Waseca County, which is in southern Minnesota. It has a population of 2,421 as of the 2020 census. The encounter took place in November of 2007 during deer hunting season. The person telling the story details how he went out to his tree stand in the early morning, bringing along his shotgun. Not long after arriving at his tree stand, he heard growling and large, heavy footsteps. He assumed it was just a coyote, but when it entered the clearing, he saw a dark brown or black dog that stood about 5 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours. Except this did not look like an ordinary dog. It had front paws that looked more like hands than a regular dog's feet, and its tail was very long and resembled that of a cat. He says the tail was about 3 feet long. When it growled, its teeth were visible, and he says they were about the size of a 2.5-inch shotgun shell. Not only had it started to come toward his stand, but he soon realized it was following his scent. In an act of fear and not wanting to die that day, he slowly raised his shotgun and pushed the safety forward. However, when it clicked, the large creature looked directly at him and set a course straight for the tree he was in. The hunter shot 3 times, with the first 2 shots hitting a tree behind the massive creature and the third striking the beast in the chest. The creature stumbled backward and ran for some thick brush nearby, taking cover. The hunter was so scared he remained in his tree stand for 3 hours. At about noon, he decided to try and make a run for his truck. When he passed the spot where he hit the large dog-like creature, he saw blood on the ground. It was only a small amount, as if the bullet did not fully penetrate the skin. He describes the blood as being dark red, almost black, and having a bad stench to it. He wasted no time in running for his truck. Later that same year, he was out trapping when he came across a destroyed trap. It was surrounded by a lot of blood and the fur from a raccoon, which was his best guess. He also saw tracks he believes were left by the Dogman he encountered earlier that year in his tree stand. He has not returned to those woods since. This isn't the first story I've heard where a hunter is in his stand and a Dogman comes sniffing around, following the hunter's scent. This brings up the question, who is hunting who? In many of these hunting encounters, the Dogmen start heading straight for the tree the hunter is in before shots are fired and they flee from the area. Who knows what would happen if the hunters didn't try to defend themselves? But I have heard that gunshots don't seem to injure these creatures. Actually, it usually just makes them angrier than they already seem to be. Do they have ill intentions for the hunters? Or do they just want them to leave their territory? In any case, it would be terrifying to be stuck in a tree stand with a Dogman circling below. I believe I'd start shooting too if I were them. What do you think? And what would you do if you were ever in that position? The next story comes from a poster who lives in East Tennessee near the Smoky Mountains. He has had 2 encounters with what he believes could have been a Dogman, so he posted online to see if anyone in eastern Tennessee has information on Dogman sightings in this area. Both of his encounters happened while he was hiking with his friends, who also saw and heard what he did. He doesn't describe either as being major encounters. The first encounter, which he says was a much closer call than the second, took place one night as he and his friends sat around their campfire. The surrounding area was completely dark. It was while he was enjoying the fire with his friends that he heard something moving in the trees behind him. Everyone in his group heard it too. This came after they heard howling not even 30 minutes before. Movement to their right caught their attention, and the OP described seeing eyes out in the dark reflecting in the light of the fire. The eyes were staring at the group as they continued to move through the trees. At first, they thought they were watching a bear because the figure shrouded in darkness was way too big to be a deer. He says he went to investigate, but doesn't say if he got a better look at whatever was out there. The second encounter also happened while he was out hiking with a group of friends. It was the second night of their trip, and they were once again sitting around their campfire at around 9 p.m., completely surrounded by darkness. The night was pierced by howling that they assumed was a group of coyotes. However, the OP got an eerie feeling, and about an hour and a half later, he thought he saw movement amongst the trees. But he didn't say anything to his friends because he did not want to freak them out. He sat there with his heart pounding, trying to convince himself that it wasn't anything major, but he says something in that moment felt extremely off to him. He says that neither encounter has substantial evidence to prove that it was a Dogman, but both times he felt something he had never felt before. And so he turned to the internet to see if anyone else had any encounters in his area where there was no doubt it was a Dogman. One commenter recommends he look into several occurrences in Coke County, Tennessee, at a place called Jimtown Road. Over the last 2 years, there have been 2 people killed under mysterious circumstances that were said to be caused by an animal. However, one investigator who is into cryptids visited the area, and the homeless people warned him to leave the area before nightfall due to the, quote, thing in the woods. There were some other commenters who said they have heard a lot of tales about Dogman sightings in the state, and particularly in that area. It would seem that eastern Tennessee might be a hotspot for Dogman activity. As for the 2 mysterious deaths, I've heard accounts where people have been killed by something that was chalked up to animals, but the circumstances surrounding these incidents point to it being anything but. There are 3 that come to mind from North Carolina alone where people were ripped to shreds, one of which in her home, where canine tracks and fur were found all over the scene and victim. The local authorities in each case tried to say it was a pack of wild dogs, but people in those areas see right through that flimsy excuse. Wild dogs don't usually attack people, and the attacks on these people seem to indicate it was something much larger and stronger than a regular dog. Plus, wild dogs do not invade homes. As for what the OP saw on 2 separate hiking trips, it's anyone's guess. With people saying there are a lot of reported Dogman sightings coming from his area, it could very well have been a Dogman each time. However, with whatever it was remaining in the shadows and no one getting a good look at it, who can say for sure? There is the feeling he got each time though that is described in a lot of encounters and sightings when cryptids are near. What do you think? Dogman or something else? The final story of this episode comes to us from the Catskill Mountains in New York State. The Catskill Mountains are located in the southeastern part of New York State. The area is named the Catskill Forest Reserve and is known for its rich wildlife, hiking trails, and ski resorts. The mountains reach an elevation of 4,180 feet and cover an area just shy of 5,900 square miles. The original poster encountered something in the woods he believes to be a Dogman while on a trip with his girlfriend. He posted his story online because everyone he tries to talk to tells him he must have misidentified another animal and won't listen. Again, we have someone turning to the internet with a story like this because they A. want to tell their story and want to be heard, and B. want help identifying what they saw. The OP booked an Airbnb for him and his girlfriend in the Catskill Mountains. It was an RV that had been converted into a cabin and expanded upon. The couple took their dog, a 100-pound German Shepherd, on the trip with them. The cabin was situated in a remote location away from other houses and on a side road that had an amazing view of the mountainside. The last night of their trip, they had a fire going in one of the 2 fire pits at the location and were sitting outside with their dog listening to music. The location of the fire pit was near the top of the mountain, approximately 800 feet away from their cabin. They had a great view of the mountain range and nearby cornfields on one side of the spot, with it backing up to the tree line on the other. As they sat there enjoying the view and listening to some music, their dog kept looking off into the trees. When he kept doing it, the girlfriend got freaked out and they even turned the music off to see if they could hear anything. But the woods sat silent. The OP had a small LED flashlight he could scan the tree line with when something caught his dog's attention, just to see if any eyes reflected in the light. But he didn't see anything. This went on for a while until their dog jumped up and stared into the trees while growling aggressively. The OP got up to turn off the music, but as he did, his dog took off toward the tree line while continuing to growl and act aggressively, which was completely out of character for their dog. He darted to the left, and that's when the OP heard something retreat a few steps in response to his dog. Luckily, the dog came to him when he called him, but he crept backward while keeping his eyes focused on the creature. The OP crept toward the tree line with his flashlight and small knife as his girlfriend grabbed their dog by the collar and held him back. He scanned the darkness with the flashlight and stopped when he saw a pair of eyes reflected in the beam. They were a lot farther back than when he heard the retreating footsteps moments before. The eyes were glowing just like a dog's eyes would in the light. The set of eyes was also way too tall to be a smaller animal, such as a raccoon, coyote, or skunk, and the OP thought he was looking at a black bear. However, black bears are very skittish when it comes to dogs and/or people and would more than likely have fled the area completely unless it was protecting its young. The OP stood there for 3 to 4 minutes watching the creature, which he determines looked like a crouching dog. At this point, his girlfriend went into shock and turned the music back on, telling him they were leaving the fire pit and going back inside. He kept telling her to turn the music back off as he made his way over to her, facing the woods the entire time and keeping his flashlight on the crouching dog. She she started back toward the cabin, dragging their dog by his collar, and the OP wasn't about to stay there by himself, so he followed behind them. As soon as he took his light off the being, it started following them from within the tree line. As they continued down the hill toward their cabin, he heard 2 other sets of footsteps, so 3 in all, following alongside them. When they reached the cabin, they locked the door, closed all the blinds, and spent the next hour listening and watching outside in hopes that whatever had followed them would step into the light coming from a spotlight that was on the cabin. They never saw anything, but they heard footsteps circling the cabin in the woods. After an hour or 2, the OP stepped outside and scanned the area with his flashlight, but he didn't see or hear anything. He closes his post by saying that his dog often chases animals such as rabbits and deer, but he never acts as aggressively as he did that night or even makes a sound when he does. The OP also says that he has spent a lot of time outdoors and can identify most animals he comes across. He has also asked a lot of his friends who hunt, but no one seems to know what he saw that night. To him, it's the mystery of not knowing what was out there that creeps him out the most. He had never heard of a Dogman until he started researching crouching dog sightings online. His girlfriend hates to talk about the encounter, so he turned to the internet to tell his story. This to me definitely sounds like a Dogman, especially since he described it as being a crouching dog. I don't know how they kept their cool walking back to the cabin with not just 1 set of footsteps behind them, but possibly 3. And I agree that not seeing whatever this was is the creepiest part, especially with it following them and then circling their cabin. In one of my recent videos, I talked about cryptids either following alongside or chasing people from just inside the tree line to seemingly escort them out of the area. I think that's what was going on here as well. Maybe the OP and his girlfriend entered their territory and the Dogmen were escorting them down the mountain to make sure they left the area. But then he says they heard footsteps all around their cabin for about an hour or 2. This points to their curiosity with humans. Dogmen and Sasquatch especially seem to be very intrigued by us. Other cryptids seem to be too on occasion, but not like Dogman and Sasquatch. Perhaps they were simply ushering the OP and his girlfriend out of their territory, or they just took an interest in them upon coming across them at the top of the mountain. Maybe it's a little of both and they circled the cabin to make sure they didn't come back into their area. Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure. I still definitely think this was multiple Dogmen though. What do you think? Dogman or something else? And do you think it was escorting them out of its territory? Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share some Dogman encounters I came across on the internet. In regard to Dogman, we normally think of encounters and sightings as a more recent phenomenon, and I believe this because people are just now coming forward to share their stories on the internet because they have places where they know they won't be ridiculed. That is what I would like to create on this channel. There are more stories than ever out there now. But sightings of these creatures and cryptids in general aren't anything new or even recent. One story in this episode comes to us from the early 2000s, while one is from 1993. I've also heard of people seeing Dogman dating back even farther than this. And there are also ancient Egypt hieroglyphics depicting Anubis, who could very well be a Dogman from ancient times. I also want to announce that you can now become a member of this channel. You can click the join button below this video or click the link in the description. Alright, let's get to the stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who had several encounters with a Dogman. One encounter in particular was absolutely terrifying as the creature actually came into his house. He does not say exactly where he lived at the time, just that it was a very rural area and approximately 20 minutes from the closest town. The 10-mile radius surrounding his home was covered by forest. The original poster, or OP, lived on a 3-mile-long dirt road. To get to that road, you had to go down a paved road with a lot of very sharp curves. The OP was on his way home from work one night after midnight, and was almost to the gravel road he lived on. He came around the last curve before reaching his road where a vineyard that had a house on the property sat. At the main entrance was a street light that lit up its immediate surroundings from dusk until dawn. He was on the curve when his bright lights illuminated the creature. It was walking out from behind the house and was right under the streetlight. It was approximately 20 to 30 feet from the road when he saw it, and it was heading directly for him. The OP could not stop staring at this creature in astonishment as it walked across the home's front yard. When it noticed him, it leaned forward and charged the car, running on 2 legs. As soon as the OP hit the straightaway after the sharp curve, this being slammed into the side of his car. He kept driving, looking out his window to see the Dogman running beside him, keeping up with him even though he was going about 50 miles an hour. He had almost 100 feet before the turn onto the gravel road that would lead him home. This is when he floored it and almost hit 70 before taking the turn. His car slid off the road as he did and up onto a hill before he was able to get control of the vehicle and bring it back down onto the road. There were 2 more streetlights where the gravel road met the paved one just past the vineyard. But after that is a long stretch of fields on either side of the road and darkness other than his headlights. After getting his car back onto the road, he was driving 50, but floored it again and got up to almost 90 miles an hour before he lost the creature. He turned off the road onto his driveway, flying up to his house before running inside, locking the doors and windows, then barricading himself in his bedroom. He would spend the next 3 nights at his girlfriend's house. One night later that week, it was again after midnight when the OP was laying in bed watching a movie before deciding to take a smoke break. Usually that late at night, instead of going outside, he will open his window, put a small fan in it, and blow the smoke outside. As he lit up his cigarette and blew his first puff of smoke out, he saw the Dogman sniffing around his car no more than 100 feet away. He started freaking out and yanked the fan out of the window before closing it. However, either the action or the smell of smoke caught the Dogman's attention because it turned and looked directly at him as he pulled down the shade. The OP immediately grabbed his gun and a samurai sword before barricading his bedroom door by pulling his dresser in front of it and wedging it firm against the door. He sunk into the corner of his room with all the lights and TV off. He then heard growling outside his window before the creature slammed into the side of his house beside it. After a long, nerve-wracking few minutes, he then heard something messing with the front door of his house, which is in the living room beside his bedroom, and the door was unlocked. He then heard the Dogman enter his house. It came to his bedroom door and he heard a low, guttural growl and heavy breathing. It tried to open his bedroom door but couldn't. The being hit the door twice before slamming into it. It didn't hit the door again, but it did stand outside it, growling for half a minute before the OP once again heard his front door being forcefully opened. Everything went silent after that. He wasn't sure if the Dogman was trying to somehow trick him or lure him out, or waiting outside for him. He didn't leave his room until the next morning. When he did exit his room, still armed, he saw a hole in his bedroom door and found his front door ajar. The hole in his bedroom door was about 8 to 12 inches in diameter. Nothing else appeared to be damaged. He has seen the Dogman at a distance 2 more times since then, but both were during the day. The first time he looked out his dining room window to see it walking along the tree line on the other side of a very large field about 200 to 300 yards away. He quickly grabbed his binoculars to see what it was up to, but it was gone by the time he got back to his window. He tried to convince himself his eyes were just playing tricks on him. The last time he saw it was when he was driving the stretch of road with fields on either side. He looked off to see it walking along before disappearing into a dense part of the forest about 150 yards away. He again tried to convince himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. He mentions that the vineyard he drives by often has been bought and sold several times in the year and a half to 2 years since he had his first encounter, when he saw this being emerge from behind the house on the vineyard's property. The last owner of the home had put up a big fence around the house and installed security cameras all over the place. He had since put the home up for sale. This makes the OP believe he had problems with the Dogman. First of all, I'd look into moving. Second, lock your front door. In all seriousness though, how terrifying would it be to have something like that come into your home? As big and strong as these creatures are said to be, I think it was toying with him and obviously trying to scare him. I say this because I don't think a dresser, no matter how well it's wedged against the door, could hold against a being like this. And instead of slamming against the house beside his window, why wouldn't it just break the window and come in that way if it wanted to hurt the OP or worse? Seems to me it just wanted to scare him. Both times it got angry when it noticed it had been seen. I wonder if that had anything to do with its aggressive responses. I've heard stories where these beings, as well as Sasquatch and others, do not like being seen. What do you think? The next story comes from a poster who prefaces his story by saying he had no idea what a Dogman was until he took to Reddit to post his story. Before discovering the name of the cryptid he encountered, he would search werewolf-like creature on the internet. That's when he found the story of an encounter from Niagara Falls, which is only about a half hour from where he lives in Ontario, Canada. The story he read was eerily similar to his own experience, which he says if he was alone during his encounter, he isn't sure he would have believed his own eyes. His story takes place on July 19th of 2016. He remembers the specific date because it was the same day as his family's annual Christmas in July celebration at his in-laws' house. There was also a full moon that night. He and his wife were on their way home taking back roads, which is very dark due to them living in a somewhat rural area. There was no traffic out because of the late hour. They were about 5 minutes from their home when the OP caught sight of something in his peripheral view near the forest on the passenger side of the car to his right. Whatever it was moving fast. He went to hit his brakes as his wife grabbed his leg. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the road. The creature also stopped directly in front of their car. He says just typing this next part gave him goosebumps. The bipedal cryptid looked at them and cocked its head. He and his wife asked each other, "Do you see that?" at the same time. He describes the creature as being about 7 feet tall with yellow eyes that glowed in his headlights. It was lean yet muscular, and the thing that stood out the most to him were this thing's legs. They were dog's legs, except this being was walking upright. It stood there glaring at them for only a moment before it took off and disappeared into the forest to his left. The only word that came to mind when they tried to describe it was werewolf. He and his wife both agreed that if they were alone, they aren't sure they would have believed what they saw. It's interesting to me that people use the term werewolf to describe these beings, but not unusual or surprising. It is the closest thing they can think of to describe what they see, as they have never heard of a Dogman before. Another reason I find it interesting is because these creatures look just like how werewolves are depicted in movies. These obviously are based on old stories, tales, and folklore and/or mythology. So who's to say the werewolves we see in movies, books, and other types of media aren't actually based off Dogmen? Maybe that's where the legends and lore come from. Very early Dogman sightings. It's just something that comes to mind when I see these cryptids described as werewolves. What do you think? The next story comes to us near Denmark, Wisconsin. Denmark is a village in Brown County and is located southeast of Green Bay. It began as a Danish settlement in 1848 and is referred to, along with Heartland, Wisconsin, as the nuclei of what developed into one of the most important regions of Danish immigration into the United States. As of the 2010 census, Denmark, Wisconsin has a population of 2,123. The original poster describes the land where his grandparents lived near Denmark as having a lot of farmland with patches of woods. He was 10 or 11 years old at the time of the encounter, which took place back in 2005 or 2006. His grandparents' land consisted of a few acres, with the far right corner of their property covered by a dense patch of woods that included a swamp. The woods and swamp extended a ways before butting up to another farm field. The OP was there standing on the back deck shooting cans with his BB gun. It was a hot, muggy July morning, and the entire time he was out there, he had an eerie feeling he couldn't get rid of. He felt like he was being watched. But when he stopped and looked around to see if anything was looking at him, he saw nothing. He would then return to shooting the cans, but the feeling would once again come over him. He scanned the tree line, and that's when he finally saw what was watching him. Standing there next to a tree was a massive creature. He went back when he was older to take a look at the tree and estimated this being to be 7 to 7.5 feet tall. He says the only comparison he can think of for this thing's body was Arnold Schwarzenegger. The creature had huge shoulders, arms, and chest. He says it's unreal just how big and muscular its features were. It had gray, shaggy fur that covered its shoulders and parts of its body. He says the head and face looked like that of a werewolf, with it having pointed ears and yellow eyes that seemed to glow even in the daylight. It had its mouth open and seemed to be snarling at him, but it almost seemed like it was smiling. The snarl or smile and the look on this thing's face was nothing short of pure evil. The OP says the only word he can use to describe it is sinister. He doesn't remember if it had a tail, but its legs looked human, except being bent like a dog's back legs. However, he was mostly focused on this thing's head and upper body. It stared at him for what felt like hours, but in reality was only about 10 seconds before it took off running through some very thick brush. It emerged farther down the tree line, then disappeared into the woods. He says the speed in which this creature covered the ground could not have been matched by a human. It ran about 50 to 60 yards in a matter of seconds. He was terrified by seeing this Dogman and ran back into the house and stayed inside for the rest of the day. His aunt later told him that she heard some weird noises around the house the night before, but she hadn't told him because she didn't want to freak him out. He didn't tell her about his Dogman sighting because he thought she might think he was crazy or making it up. He insisted she tell him what she heard though. She described hearing a loud growling and snarling walking around the house and said it was unlike anything she had ever heard. He still visits his grandparents but hasn't seen anything since and hasn't heard about any other sightings in the area. He does say that there was a Sasquatch sighting down the road from their house back in the 60s or 70s. Again, we have another description where the original poster says the Dogman looked like a werewolf. They are also often described as being extremely muscular and having a body that resembles a bodybuilder. And this isn't the first time I've heard a story where it seems to snarl at someone in a sinister way, or someone hearing loud growling right outside their home, as the aunt described. Also, the speed in which these beings can move is amazing. To be able to cover hundreds of yards in a matter of seconds is incredible. What do you think about this experience? The next story comes to us from Michigan, which should be no surprise to anyone in a Dogman episode because Michigan seems to be a hotspot for this cryptid. It is also notorious for sightings of other types of cryptids as well, especially Sasquatch. The original poster only says that he lives in central Michigan, about 20 minutes north of Lansing. He was unfortunate enough to have 2 Dogman encounters. The first happened when he was on his way home from work at about 1:45 a.m. He was driving around 55 miles an hour when he saw something approximately 200 yards in front of him stand up on 2 legs in the ditch on the passenger side of his car. The creature took 3 or 4 running steps before it leapt about 6 to 7 feet in the air and completely cleared a 24-foot road from right to left. When it landed on the other side, it dropped down on all 4s and took off into the field to his left. The OP slowed down to try and get a better look at this thing, taking in just how big this creature was. It had black fur and it was extremely fast. It ran to a group of trees in the middle of a field and covered a distance of about 150 yards in a matter of seconds. That's when he lost sight of it. He says it had to have been about 8 feet tall because he could see the torso and head when it stood up in the ditch, which was about 3 to 4 feet deep. He isn't exactly sure what it was, but says by the look of the creature, it definitely fit the description of a Dogman. His next sighting would take place at a park near his home. He had just bought his first night vision monocular and took his girlfriend to the park to look at stars. It was about 8:30 when they got to the park. They powered up the monocular and started scanning the surrounding area while also checking out the sky. They did this for about 15 minutes before they saw a police officer pull into the park. The OP assumed he was there to ask them what they were doing, so he told his girlfriend to turn the flashlight on her phone on to signal him and show him they weren't trying to hide or that they weren't up to no good. The park they were in has a roundabout that begins at the entrance and circles around to the side exit. The officer pulled his vehicle, a Tahoe, around to the side exit before he stopped. Curious, the OP started watching him through his night vision monocular and saw something behind the vehicle. The officer must have seen it too because about that time he gunned it. The OP says he was about 100 yards away from where the officer's truck was, maybe a little more, and it was hard to make out the creature through his night vision monocular. But whatever it was, this thing was taller than the officer's Tahoe and it started chasing it. Then, as if it somehow knew it was being looked at, the creature squatted down onto his haunches and turned to lock eyes with the OP. He says its eyes were glowing and he could see what looked like a canine's head. However, he isn't 100% sure about that. He and his girlfriend took off running, but the creature did not chase them. It just sat there staring at them as they ran. This is what leads him to believe it was a Dogman and not something else. He goes on to say it squatted down like a human, but this thing was way too big to be a man. Since the sighting, he has wanted to ask the officer what he saw, but the officer did not stop to talk to them that night, and the OP never sought him out. He says it was one of the weirdest and creepiest things he has ever experienced. I couldn't imagine having one Dogman encounter, but to have 2? I guess that's just life in Michigan. Seriously though, Michigan seems to be Dogman central. I wonder what it is about the state that attracts them. We again have another description of a Dogman running at very high speeds, covering hundreds of yards in a matter of seconds, which matches up with other stories I've heard and read. This to me adds credence and believability to these stories. And for those of you who may be wondering what a monocular is, think binoculars but with one lens. What do you think of this man's 2 encounters? The final story of this episode comes to us from South Carolina way back in 1993. The original poster's encounter took place in a small town called Rembert. Rembert is located in central South Carolina and covers a total area of just 4.4 square miles. It has a population of just 306 people according to the 2010 census. The OP describes it as a very small 2-stoplight rural town. His encounter took place on March 8, 1993, when he was 13 years old. He remembers the date because it coincided with a full moon that garnered a lot of attention due to just how full and how bright it was that night. He was not the only one to see the Dogman that night either, as his stepfather, mother, and his sister all witnessed what he did. He and his family were on their way back home to Sumter, South Carolina from visiting family in Columbus. During their trip, they passed through Rembert just after getting off the highway. As they entered the small town, they saw an abandoned red car with all 4 doors open and no one inside, which brought them to an immediate stop. There was no one around the car and no one in sight. Their internal alarms were all going off at this point, and the OP, his mother, and his sister were all urging his stepfather not to stop for fear of this being a trap to rob unsuspecting passersby. His stepfather began slowly working his way around the stopped vehicle when the creature approached their car. The OP estimates that it was at least 10 feet tall. It reminded him of visiting New York City for the first time, where he had to turn his head and look straight up just to take in the sight of the skyscrapers in full view. The towering cryptid now standing beside their car was covered in jet black fur and was walking upright on its hind legs. It had very long, sharp claws and extremely sharp teeth, which were visible as it snarled at the OP and his family. But he says the most disturbing thing was the creature's glowing green eyes. He has never seen anything glow in his entire life like those eyes were glowing that night. The only thing that came to mind he could compare this thing to was a werewolf he had seen in horror movies. Except this thing was more realistic and more frightening. A living, breathing monster in the flesh, standing right beside his car. Even 28 years after the event, when he typed his story to post it, he still got chills thinking about this being. Now stopped due to this Dogman crossing the road in front of them, they sat in complete shock watching this creature walk around their vehicle while breathing heavily. In fact, the OP says it didn't seem interested in them at all and looked as if it was in some sort of trance as it disappeared into the cornfields on the opposite side of the road from where it came. His stepfather wasted no time and stomped on the gas pedal, taking off, speeding away from the scene. The whole encounter happened in the span of about 10 seconds. However, it felt like it was happening in slow motion to the OP. Over the years, they didn't speak much about their encounter, but when they did, they all agreed it was something not of this world. They were unsure if the full moon had anything to do with it, and he knows how cliché it sounds mentioning how werewolves come out during a full moon. He has not told a lot of people about his experience for fear of being called crazy or being accused of making it up due to it being outside of people's understanding and conflicting with their views and/or beliefs. His mother and sister have since passed away, but he does sometimes mention it to his stepfather because it has stuck with him all these years and still randomly pops into his head out of nowhere. He still wonders what happened to the people in the red car and thinks perhaps the creature had something to do with why they were nowhere to be seen that night. He does wonder if he and his family were the only ones to see this thing and doesn't remember any headlines or stories about it. He came across other stories online and wanted to share his encounter. It really is something how often the eyes are what stands out to the people who have these encounters with these cryptids, and how everything happens in a matter of seconds, but it feels like it is either happening in slow motion or taking much longer to transpire than it actually does. These are small details from the stories I hear and read about from all over the world that not only add credence to these tales, but make me believe them. It would be too much of a coincidence to find the same details in all of these stories from thousands of people from all over the world. What a terrifying experience that would have been, not just to see the Dogman, but for them to see an abandoned car at the scene too. It makes you wonder what happened to whoever was inside. By the sound of the story though, it doesn't sound like anything good. What do you think? Hello and welcome to my channel. My fascination with cryptids began a few years ago when I was on vacation listening to my cousin tell stories about Bigfoot and Dogman. I started listening to and reading every story I could find about every type of cryptid. This led to me starting this channel so I could read these stories I find so fascinating. In this episode, I'm going to do something a little different. All 3 encounters come from the same person and are broken up into 3 parts, one for each post. The first encounter he had with this unknown humanoid creature that sounds a lot like a crawler was while he was walking alone in the woods. Unable to put the first encounter behind him, he gathered some friends and went back into those same woods only to have a second encounter with this cryptid. He then has a small update giving a very brief, vague account of the third and final encounter and how he is doing in the aftermath. I'm finding more and more that the crawler stories I come across are some of the creepiest cryptid stories. This one is no different. So stick around for the full story because this isn't one you'll want to miss. If you are a hardcore believer, a skeptic with an open mind, or a non-believer, you are welcome here. I just ask that you keep it respectful in the comment section. No one should be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Alright, now let's get to today's stories. Our OP lives in South Carolina, south of Charleston. Established in 1670 as Charlestown, Charleston became the first comprehensively planned town in the 13 original colonies. The city has a rich history and is no stranger to paranormal activity. It is considered the most haunted city in South Carolina, so it makes sense that cryptids would also be encountered in the surrounding areas. The OP was left absolutely terrified by his encounter and turned to the internet to unburden himself and to seek help. He describes himself as a science-based person who always seeks out logical explanations for the things that happen around him. He desperately wanted to believe that there was a logical explanation for what he saw in those woods, but sometimes there just isn't a logical way to explain some of the things that happen in this world. Before the pandemic, he used to go on evening walks as a form of leisurely activity and to decompress from his stressful days at work. But due to the pandemic, he was forced to take some bad shifts at work and was unable to continue his evening routine. That is, until he decided he would try to work in a walk late one night. So he put on his headband flashlight and ventured down a familiar trail that starts near his neighborhood and extends about 4 miles into the woods. His plan this evening was to walk 1.5 miles down this trail, turn around on a neighboring trail that ran parallel to this one, and walk home for a total of 3 miles. Everything was normal for the first mile and just a little beyond that, but then our OP got the distinct feeling that he was being watched. He had been hearing footsteps in the leaves off the trail for almost 5 minutes and thought that he was being followed. When that uncomfortable feeling of being watched came over him, he stopped, turned off his headlamp, and just listened. But he didn't hear anything. He stood there in silence, trying to rationalize the noise as an animal or somebody up to no good. He decided then that it was time to head home, so he turned his light back on and started his trek back the way he had come. Not 2 minutes later, he heard the footsteps again, but this time they sounded different. Whatever was following him was now walking on 4 feet instead of 2 as he had previously heard, and it had quickened its pace too, matching his. He spun around, his headlamp still on and the light on his phone aimed down the path behind him. Nothing. He grew angry and yelled out, "Leave me alone. I'm going to call the cops, and if you come at me, I have a knife." Again, nothing. "Get the F out of here," he yelled as he started toward where the footsteps had come from. That's when he saw it. What looked to be a naked man about 20 yards down the path running at full speed on all 4s into the woods. His initial thought was a person on drugs, but the area where he lives doesn't have any drug problems. But he quickly discredited this thing as a person because of what it looked like. It was almost completely hairless, had a bald head, pale white skin, and looked way too natural running on all 4s. When it ran, its back was flat and it was fast. Its bone structure suggested that this creature was designed to run on all 4s. What happened next, according to the OP, was straight out of a horror movie. He continued down the path, all the while looking over his shoulder, not hearing anything. He was almost home free when he heard something charging through the leaves in the woods. He whipped around, and as soon as he did, the noise ceased. Then he saw the slow movement of a head emerging from behind a tree. He screamed at the creature in an attempt to intimidate it, but failed. And what he heard next, he says he will never forget. This thing cackled at him, the tone of which was pure mockery. He had only ever heard a cackling like that in nature documentaries and describes it as sounding like a monkey. He felt like prey being toyed with by its predator. He wasn't going to stick around a second longer and took off running, sprinting all the way home. Being a logical person, he tried to find a rational explanation for what he encountered, but dismissed the thoughts of this incident just being a prank or a rabid diseased coyote. He got a good look at his stalker and it was humanoid. Human feet, hands, head, even buttocks. But that's where its similarities to a human end. He called the police when he got home but did not tell them exactly what he saw for fear that they would think he was crazy. They scoured the area he encountered the creature but found nothing. They did notice that the leaves had been disrupted and followed 50 feet into the woods but lost the trail when it ended in a large grassy area. They found no footprints in the area. This is where his first encounter ends, but he needed answers, and he resolved to go back into those woods. After his first encounter, our OP was clearly distraught and disturbed by his frightening ordeal and just couldn't let it go. After cycling through all possible rational explanations to explain what he saw, he came to the conclusion that it couldn't have been a prank, a drugged out or mentally ill person, or a sick, deformed animal. He was a heavy skeptic at the time, and although his skepticism of all things paranormal persisted, he was warming to the idea that crawlers may actually exist. His encounter continued to nag him. He couldn't let it go. He needed to know what he saw that night, so he decided to go back into the woods. However, this time, he would be prepared and he would bring backup. He contacted 3 friends and described in full detail everything that happened that night. He told them of his intention to go back out there and asked if they would accompany him. Even though they, like him, were non-believers, they all had an adventurous side and loved spooky stuff, so they all agreed without hesitation. One friend brought a pistol, one a shotgun, and the OP also had a pistol. The third friend would carry 2 flashlights. One of the 2 flashlights would be his phone so he could have his camera ready to take pictures. They got together and waited until it was completely dark, setting off into the woods at around 9:30 p.m., going down the same trail. Fear and adrenaline were coursing through our OP, causing his heart to pound as they entered the woods. He felt more confident this time though, armed and with his friends. They were joking around with him at first and he tried to return their jests, but knowing he might once again see this thing that had stalked and terrified him made him nervous. They went the entire 1.5 miles down the trail he had planned on walking during his first trip, but saw and heard nothing. The preparation for this excursion and the anticipation of facing this thing kept them from giving up so easily, so they kept going. They walked about 5 to 8 more minutes and were approaching the 2-mile mark when they began hearing noises. The noises came from way back in the woods, not close, but loud enough that they took notice. The OP told his friend holding the flashlights to turn them off. He did, and they listened. They heard footsteps, and they were coming closer. Something bipedal was making its way toward them. The footsteps were heavy and they were loud. The OP called out when whatever it was coming their way was no more than 20 to 30 yards away. Is someone there? The footsteps halted, but only momentarily. When they started again, all 4 men could tell it was something on all 4s and it was heading straight for them. His friend turned the flashlights back on, but the woods were too dense to see anything. The trees close to the trail were sparse, but the foliage quickly grew dense the farther into the woods that you went. When the lights came back on, the sprinting footfalls stopped. Everyone stood in complete silence. The OP points out that whether or not you believe in the paranormal, hearing what they just heard would instill fear in anyone. His friend unholstered his pistol and kept it at the ready. Their eyes met and he could tell that his friend was no longer having a good time. The friend holding the camera was visibly shaking, his eyes darting from friend to friend. The third friend yelled, "I see you, come out. Stop effing with us. We have guns and we'll shoot. I don't want to hurt you over some dumb joke. Come on now." The only response was that horrible cackle. But this time it was more of a shriek and the creature sounded agitated. There was absolutely nothing the OP could compare to that terrible noise, as it sent a chill down his spine. His friend, who was standing right next to him, fired his shotgun into the woods, causing the OP's ears to ring. He could no longer hear anything, but followed his friend's eyes as they began tracking something running from left to right. He caught a glimpse of the same tall humanoid creature he had seen before, running on all fours before disappearing behind a tree. The friend who fired at the being took a step in that direction but was stopped by the one holding the flashlight, who told his friend that he fired buckshot and that there was no way he did not hit that thing. Adding evidence to this claim were the bullet holes filling the tree this thing darted behind. If the tree was hit by that many bullets, there's no way the creature didn't get hit. Or so they thought. The friend holding the shotgun then asked, "What if I hit it but it didn't hurt it?" They were all taken aback by the question. What if that was true? If he did in fact hit this thing, why hadn't it fallen over? The OP estimated that the being was anywhere from 6 feet to 6 feet 4 and somewhere in the neighborhood of 145 to 165 pounds. If it was still on its feet after getting shot, it wasn't something they wanted to be messing with. Then, that same mocking cackle he heard during his first encounter broke the silence. It no longer sounded agitated, but like it was enjoying itself and the fear it instilled in the four men. His friend fired in the direction of the cackle and he caught a glimpse of something running deeper into the woods, only for a second or two before it disappeared from the light. It was running way faster than what was possible for a human to be running on 4 legs. With the encounter over and the creature gone, they jogged the 2 miles back to the OP's house where they discussed the night's events. Everyone saw the same thing. All 3 of his friends were now believers, none of them discrediting his story. Their conversation quickly turned to what this thing could have been, and after reading some comments on the original post and doing some research, they all concluded that it was a crawler. They are all still skeptics when it comes to cryptids and the paranormal, but this event went a long way to making them true believers. But they all knew one thing for sure. They were going to go back out there, and next time they would be even more prepared, equipped with recording devices and better able to remain calm should they encounter this thing again. The third and final post of this harrowing tale isn't very long and is more of an update that gives a brief overview of what happened and how the OP is doing in the aftermath of his 3 encounters. He does apologize for not detailing the encounter in full, but was left too traumatized to be able to revisit the events at that time. He and his friends did go back out into those woods in search of the crawler, but the encounter did not go as they expected. They prepared for this third encounter by packing stronger flashlights, 2-way radios, a better camera, knives, a bat, and the same firearms that they brought during the second encounter. They even recruited a new team member who would stay behind in the OP's home in the event of an emergency. They were confident, perhaps too confident, and it led to them playing a game for which they were ill-equipped. The vague details given by the OP indicate a grisly encounter. They found the crawler again, but this time it got up close and personal with them. The best way to describe what he says next is to say it in his own words. The things that happened while in its presence have haunted my nightmares and plagued my mind during the days. One of his friends was badly hurt, to the extent that his injuries required medical attention. They weren't life-threatening, but the OP does say that he didn't look good after what took place. He did make a full recovery physically. Mentally, however, he is worse off than the OP. Like so many stories I've heard and so many people before him after having an encounter with these cryptids, the OP is experiencing PTSD and has begun therapy to try and deal with what happened during that third encounter. And understandably so. He went through a horrific ordeal. One commenter mentioned the change in him from one post to the next. I too noticed this as I was reading the story. There is a drastic change in tone and the way he writes from the first post to this last one. He never did make another post detailing in full what happened during that third and final encounter, but has let everyone know since then that he is doing much better. I will be keeping an eye on this one, and if there is another post, I'll be sure to share it. But if it never comes, I don't think anyone can blame him for not wanting to relive that horrific night. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.